Hey everyone, I'm Mitch. Welcome to MT Guitar. Today I want to share with you the genius of Jimi Hendrix in a single song. Learning this specific song, which is Purple Haze, had such a profound impact on me. I started to learn combining riffs and chords, right? Hendrix always seemed to have a firm grasp on knowing how to play lead and rhythm at the same time. So I'm going to play some of these parts here and demonstrate that. Another thing is he literally invented the name of a chord. We call it the Hendrix chord, right? So, right? And I'm going to talk about the pedals in a sec. So this is called the Hendrix chord. We want to look at the history of this chord. This is an E7 sharp 9. All right, it's a dominant chord with a sharp 9. But it's a very powerful chord, and it was a chord that was used quite a bit in blues and jazz especially, and then later R&B and Motown extensively. And it wasn't really commonly used for any hits in the pop rock sort of genres. It was seen as a pretty tense chord that you can use sparingly in, like I said, blues, jazz, and R&B largely. Hendrix was an R&B and studio musician, so he brought that into his playing very cleverly to where almost people barely noticed. But this is also the way he strums it is very sort of funk and soul and inspired as well as R&B. Hendrix bridged the gap with the song between many styles of music, including blues, R&B, experimental classical music, jazz, and folk. He was a big Bob Dylan fan and a big classical fan. And he connected all of these styles to modern pop and rock as we know it through his parts. It was a sort of a bringing together of many styles of music. Purple Haze really was born out of riffs that Chas Chandler, the bassist, heard him play and said, that's going to be a hit. Right? Those riffs were the genesis of this song, the birth of this song. We learn about blues a lot of times through riffs. If you take a lot of great songs, there's some riffs going on, borrowing from the blues scales, the pentatonic scales, inside the 12-bar blues form many times. Not on this song, but a lot of times. Which brings me back to a lesson I just did recently. You should check out on Every Guitarist Needs the Blues and the 4 steps to learn it. But here is a great example of riffs being front and center to this song. And so Hendrix developed these riffs with the encouragement of Chas Chandler. He masterfully creates little variations every time. There's nothing exactly the same. Even the way he does a vibrato. He was a meticulous studio musician. So this is another thing about Hendrix that's probably underappreciated, is that he was a beast in the studio, meticulously planning, kind of like a producer would, every aspect of the song. He would go home and think about the parts and come into the studio, and he wouldn't stop until it was perfect. Known as a perfectionist in the studio, someone who would spend long hours until they got it right. Speaking of the studio, he was also a pioneer of using effects. All right, so I'm going to talk about what effects I'm using and talk about the effects that were used throughout the song. So Hendrix is using a fuzz pedal the whole time. He's using wah-wah, which doesn't work as well solo, so I'm using a tremolo with sort of a similar wobbling setting that he used, because it sort of drops out too much if you do wah-wah without drums and bass, I find. Tremolo and fuzz are the starting places here. I've also got my delay and chorus on, which kind of just thickens up and fattens up the sound. And that's about it. Then for the octave, he is basically using an Octavia sort of pedal or an octave harmonizer. And I've got a high octave that's basically with my whammy pedal, and it's basically the same thing. It harmonizes the guitar part up an octave on that first solo when it's like, so we have the riff going into the solo. He turns it off. Back on. Back off. So that is a beautiful solo that he turns on this octave pedal, and it's just completely mind-blowing. To capture that in the studio and to make a massive hit with it is also not easy. So that was a mind-blowing solo, especially at the time when people were not hearing things like that in many, many ways. Let's start with the effects. Just the octave alone was a massive game changer that wasn't really widely used at that time. This later became possible through a whammy pedal, which I'm using right now to create that octave effect. You have all sorts of options and settings you can do with that. I usually do what this is, which is 1 octave up if I'm using it, which is rare, but it's kind of nice, especially for a studio setting, to have that option. This became a whammy pedal. Hendrix was often credited as being the reason for many pedals. So you have fuzz, you have this wah-wah, which I'm using tremolo, then you have the octavizer, or the whammy here. Beyond the effects, we also have the classical Indian sort of influence and inspiration. The Beatles were also on this tip. We got to understand that in the late 60s, in the psychedelic era, and in the music and hippie and arts era that was going on here, Indian sitar music was really big. And you can thank the Beatles for that in large part. We hear it on Stones records as well, and this and that. But just in general, in the hippie and counterculture movement, Indian improvisation was seen as like the crown jewel of transcendental music and art that got you to the next level. And so Hendrix was surely interested in that, of course. And what's happening here is when he's doing the solo, which I'm not going to turn on all my distortion, but if I do, he's basically doing a lot of one string phrases, which is a big sitar kind of technique. And then also quick phrases. So it's like, and also like quick hammer-ons, really fast, rapid speed slurs is a big aspect of sitar sort of improvisation. Quick slides, fast slurs, Now, there he's playing over D major, which is not the chord necessarily. It's an E minor progression, but he's playing over the D chord, which is the flat 7. Basically, he's deciding this is actually a jazz thing. Many jazz musicians in the 60s were playing modally, so they're going to play over a D mode, Mixolydian mode happens to be, instead of the E minor key. And that's a choice you can make as an improviser. So Hendrix was pulling from Indian music, he's pulling from jazz. The high guitar parts with the octavizer give reference to almost like a tape loop kind of classical music technique. So he's pulling from all these influences, and we know this chord is, of course, an R&B and blues and jazz chord. And we can hear this type of playing in George Harrison and Paul McCartney's playing on Taxman, which, listen to that solo, and Paul McCartney's ripping in honor of George, really, because George was into the sitar. He's ripping sort of an Indian style, sitar style guitar solo. Now, both solos are tight and short and really catchy, which I'm going to play the second one in a bit. And that's sort of a hallmark of Hendrix's, skill set in the studio. He was able to create amazingly short and tight solos. Many times the songs couldn't be long. Hendrix wanted to appeal to a wide audience, and so he wasn't going to do super long cuts necessarily. And so the solos are really well crafted. He also pioneered the thumb over technique, of course. After the Hendrix chord, E7 sharp 9. This is a thumb over approach. Okay? And he doesn't really do much on the G, but you can hear him do some riffs on the A once in a while. Now, the reason that's possible is in large part because he's freeing up some of his fingers here. He's freeing up his pinky. When you have this, if I get my pinky off, I sort of change the chord. And if I have this, I tend to do bars anyway. I'm not a big thumb over guy, but I will say Hendrix really changed the game. Even if you are not doing thumb over all the time, just to understand that this is an A chord. We don't need the bar. And so Hendrix was some of the earliest examples of, okay, we can just play the thumb over and play riffs and melodies over that. So experiment with that. See if you can get a couple cool things going on. Now, many in the mainstream thought, and still probably think, that this song is purely psychedelic in meaning, and that it's, drug related. But Hendrix clearly stated that this is a love song set in a sci-fi world. Hendrix was a big fan of sci-fi, and he watched a lot of early 60s sci-fi things. And so Hendrix described this song as like a lady who casts a spell on someone, hence the lyrics, "Am I happy or in misery? Whatever it is, that girl put a spell on me." You can imagine almost music like in a 60s show with some of these effects, okay? And so in sci-fi shows, there was a lot of special music effects. And we hear that with the octave up. For instance, like when at the end of the song, you hear somebody say, "Purple Haze," and it's all lowered in pitch. It almost sounds like it could be in the Twilight Zone. Then at the very end, with the second solo, you have some really out there stuff that also sounds like it's sort of sci-fi-ish. So in that second solo, you've got that kind of thing where it's like, you know, and then he starts doing this real. It sounds like a different world, and if I go really extreme, it's not going to sound as good. But that really crazy 2 octaves up is in there as an overdub, but mainly it's a. He's basically in position 1 of E minor pentatonic, but he's bending to the root with unison with the octave up, so it's super high, and we're getting a wide vibrato. So he's very carefully planning all this to create a world, and so that's where Purple Haze somewhat is misunderstood as purely this one thing, but it, you know, it's also this as well, or more so this whole world of, you know, way up there with the octaves, and then an overdub of this. So we want to see this song as a masterclass in blues, in storytelling, in sort of creating variations with these riffs, creating new chords, creating new chord names from old chords and old styles and bringing them to the forefront, and revolutionizing the ability to play lead and rhythm at the same time. All of these things. It's just, I mean, I'm probably missing a bunch as well, but this is the starting place. I'm going to be teaching this, like I said, in the next video. We're sort of doing a Purple Haze series. I'm really excited about that. I'm going to be teaching Purple Haze in the next video, playing through the whole thing and all the solos, and then teaching each part to you. Should I do it on acoustic or electric? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. Remember to subscribe, hit the bell icon and the thumbs up. And please learn this song with me coming up in the next video. This is a song that I can't recommend enough to combine the blues, rock, R&B, jazz, and everything else that he's pulling from, whether it's classical music, Indian music. Just wild what he can do with one song. So, thanks everyone. Hope you're doing well. We'll talk to you later. Bye.